Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode, a special Memorial Day episode of Faith Unaltered. I'm your host, Tyler Fowler. With me is my good friend, Craig Truglia. Brother, it's been a while since you've been back on. It's a pleasure to have you back with us to talk about the authenticity of Pseudo Dionysius. Welcome. How you been?
It's good to be here, Tyler. I broke out my special camera just for you.
Hey, I am honored, sir. I truly am. What have you been up to since the last time we've talked?
Uh, let's see. Well, in the apologetics world, it's the same script for the Icon documentary. It's done. It's in a matter. It's in production. Um,
Right on.
Sometimes I really just want to talk about my sources because it's so exciting. A lot of the things I've read.
Yeah.
And it's not just a matter of hype. It's just a matter of it really needs to be seen the way you should see it in documentary form to really, I think most people get it. It's a visual format, right?
Right,
So like
right.
talk about icons. So it's something that I've been coy about for that reason because I just have this artistic vision of how people should really see it. Other than that, I got really good feedback from a recent article I had published on the Anastasian forgeries from one of the leading scholars. So that was really exciting. I mean, for me, that's like, I don't know, that's like Aaron Judge if you watch baseball saying, "I like your swing, kid," you know.
There you go.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
So that stuff's been keeping me busy enough, other than, things in the real world, working, paying the bills, dealing with family, just like all of us.
Yeah, right on, right on. I cannot wait for the Icon documentary to come out. I've kind of been following you on that. But when, for those who don't know, when are you planning to release? I know you said it's in production, so obviously we're going to take a little time to get that done. But when are you planning to release that?
Well, my Dio Creative, to plug them, he's producing it, and I think like an artist, it's a matter of inspiration. So I've already seen his production notes. Like he could
Okay.
like camera scans here, picture of this 80s old VHS vibe. So I see the production notes. Like I know there's storyboarding going on.
Yeah, yeah.
And so but I would guess the end of the summer would be my guess. But I can't speak for him, whatever.
Sure,
So
sure.
only he knows. He's producing it.
Lord willing, right?
Yes.
I hear you. All right. Well, we are here today to talk about Dionysius, so Saint Dionysius, and some of are we talking, I mean, I guess my first question for you is, are we talking about all of the writings that are labeled Pseudo Dionysius being authentic? And if not, then what specific writings are we talking about?
Essentially all of them but one letter.
Okay.
Apparently there's one additional letter. You will find it like on Tertullian.org. I think it's letter 10. I can't remember.
Okay.
But there's one additional letter that's not in the earliest manuscripts. There's nothing really particularly wacky in it or anything like that, but it's we'd be going by everything other than that. So it's, for all intents and purposes, it's the whole tamale.
Okay. Right on, right on. I know ecclesiastical hierarchy is one of the more read ones in our scene, and then with that outside of orthodoxy, that's a name I've heard, a writing that I've heard more so than like his individual letters or whatever. What are a couple more? Would we talk about like the mystical names? Would that be one? And then anything else that you would add that's more famous, I guess we could say?
Yeah, divine names, celestial hierarchy. Like I said, all the major works would be they appear to have all been part of like one corpus or book when they have to come down to us, because we know eternally from those letters there's more books. They're just not extant anymore. And there's indications they were extant even in the 4th century, but they were lost probably by the time it was the 6th century for whatever reason. So it's hence we're talking about the surviving corpus. There's still more. We only have fragments of what's outside that corpus.
Right. That's why we're always digging to find more, right?
It's, you know what, I'd say there's no way they're going to find it, but
yeah,
if you would have told me a year ago, someone would have came up smoking gun arguments, the authenticity of Dionysian corpus, I would have not believed you. It's something I looked in seriously enough, and even into like peculiar things of like Greek words that are too theologically loaded, supposedly to have been used by Dionysius. And we find that even terms like that have pre-Nicene usage. Other
Really?
scholarship doesn't talk about it, but it's plainly in authentic texts from like St. Hippolytus, even in pre-Christian texts like Philo.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's what it comes down to it was something I looked into seriously and for good reason was skeptical about, and just the overwhelming evidence has turned me, I suppose, into the most public figure expounding it. But it's not my thesis; it's the thesis of Evangelos Nikitopoulos,
Okay.
and he's the real genius behind this.
And for those watching, if you have not watched that interview, I will link that into the description below. And I have not done that yet, so I'll do that as soon as we wrap up this conversation. For those that are interested in it, or you can go to Craig's channel and just scroll down. I think you recently released that. That was a pretty recent episode you did, wasn't it?
Yes, there's an episode on the authenticity of the corpus on my own channel,
Mm-hmm.
and also on Telos Bound. And I also recently did a video on, with full knowledge of it being true, what are the ramifications of this for, let's say, Protestants?
Right.
This is a find bigger than, Saint Ignatius, and arguably Saint Clement. It's essentially the Dead Sea Scrolls of Christianity. It's gigantic when
Nice.
people really come to grips with the significance of the authenticity of the Nicene corpus.
Right. Well, I know we're going to be getting into that here in just a little bit, specifically what is talked about within the corpus and how it relates to Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism, even Roman Catholicism. But first, I just want to ask you straight up, because not me and you, but if you want in on this conversation, let me know. But I'm going to be doing an episode here soon. We're going to get that thing scheduled. I've got Father Joseph Gleason, I've got Father John Whiteford, and then my subdeacon Jeremy Conrad coming on to discuss, who I think is watching in the live chat right now. So what's going on, Jeremy? Shout out to Jeremy. But we're going to be doing a discussion about why those who profess the name of Christ ought or should believe what the early church fathers have written down, especially whenever it comes to the consensus of the fathers. And so my question, just straight up, just on a personal note, Craig, why, in your opinion, should people believe what St. Dionysius or anyone else, let's say pre-Nicene or even after, why should people believe the writings and especially the consensus of the fathers on certain doctrines and things that they taught?
There's several reasons for this, but I think this lays bare the question of authority, right? If the only authority is the scriptures, then it really wouldn't be entirely relevant what other people think.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that being said, I would like to make multiple appeals where, even accepting, which I do accept, a material sufficiency of the scriptures, that every essential doctrine of the Orthodox Christian faith is in the scriptures, we
Mm-hmm.
just don't interpret them in isolation. And so we have good reason to use the consensus of the fathers to interpret the scriptures and to understand doctrine, instead of understanding doctrine from the scriptures in isolation. And here are those reasons. Like, one is the obvious one, the historical,
Mm-hmm.
right? I wasn't alive at the time when the scriptures were written. You weren't. Also, I mean, we already use these people's writings in order to understand the Greek terminology in these scriptures, because that's how you do etymology. You study the meaning of words.
Right.
So you already just historically are dependent upon these early sources.
Mm-hmm.
And so this could be too easily dumbed down as to, well, look at all these people who believed X in the first 400 years of the church. And people kind of gloss over, like, 400 years is a long time. America has not existed for 400 years.
Right.
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 If I had an opinion of an American 90 years ago, that would be not very indicative of another American's opinion 250 years before that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Let alone, like, if 400 years pretty much gets us to the Mayflower almost, right? It's a 405 years or something like that ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say that, put things in context. So, like, you can't just simply say, oh, well, it's from, even before Nicaea, the year 325. That's still almost 300 years. That's a long time. America, right, again, is not yet 300 years old.
Right.
And so it could be dumbed down a little too much, and almost arbitrarily so, from both sides, Orthodox and the Protestants. We see, for example, like a Protestant canard, like, oh, well, unless you could see a pre-Nicene source with this, I don't accept it. Like, well, why that? Why is the year 325 magical, right? It's
Right.
so so I just spent a lot of time almost arguing against the historical criteria because that seems to take a lot of guys out of it.
Mhm.
But that being said, a good historian would look at, okay, well, obviously sources that existed at the time of the scriptures would be highly relevant, which we do have, right? First Clement is probably younger than the Book of Revelation. The Didache is probably younger than the Book of Revelation. The Nicene Corpus is just slightly older than the Book of Revelation. St. Ignatius' writings is maybe 10, 15 years older than the Book of Revelation.
Oh wow.
So it's so like that starts becoming credible. So, right, like I would trust what an American in 1795 remembers about maybe 1780.
Yeah.
He could be wrong. People forget last week, right? So it's not infallible by any stretch of the imagination.
Mhm.
But historically speaking, it's highly relevant.
Mhm.
And we actually don't have a shortage of highly relevant early sources, which we have to at least, without getting to any spiritual criteria, take very seriously, right? We have to take Ignatius very seriously. We have to take Clement very seriously. We have to take Polycarp very seriously. We have to take the Didache very seriously.
Mhm.
We would have to take certain archaeological finds from the first century very seriously. I argue we have to take Dionysius very seriously. And
Mhm.
it's because of legitimate historical proximity.
Mhm.
Now, once we start getting a little past that, what becomes relevant is the consistency with an early historical witness. So a source 300 years older is not irrelevant, right? There's American values that existed in the 1700s that still exist today. Someone goes, what do you think is good about America? They say, well, that we're all created equal. Well, okay. But that comes from the Declaration of Independence. So someone could still say that now, and it's a relevant continuation of what's in the past.
Right.
So if we could find things in the past and find relevant continuations, that shows that there is good historical legitimacy in even later sources because we could source their ideas from earlier on.
Mhm.
Now, so again, that's kind of boring, but I purposely want to give that dry historical discussion because it's the most neutral, right? I think all of us could say, all right, according to materialist philosophy, I could accept that,
Right.
But let's talk about the spiritual criteria. We have, all right, the scriptures were our oldest copies are from essentially the Nicene era, a little afterwards, and we have
Mhm.
some fragmentary evidence before them.
Mhm.
And so, if you have a very corrupt church, like a great apostasy that existed even by Dionysius' time, right? There's could be stuff in Dionysius people don't want to accept. So you would have to say, all right, one of the people that knew the apostles was part of this great apostasy. That's not irrational. It's not impossible. I mean, Third John talks about Diotrephes. We know
Mhm.
there's people during the scripture's existence that are bad, and we're told they're wrong, right? So it's not
Right.
that it's logically impossible. It starts getting to more of a spiritual problem. And what authority are our scriptures if they were preserved by people that we don't trust whatsoever? Right now, again, a magisterial Protestant, a high church Lutheran, a high church Anglican, they're not going to say that. So again, this critique is not meant to put them all in one basket. It's just to make the point there has to be some sort of spiritual authority of the early church because if they're the means in which to preserve what has absolute authority, the scriptures, they have to have some sort of authority. If they had none, then the scriptures lose all authority themselves. It almost becomes arbitrary. It becomes essentially becomes the Book of Mormon, right?
Mhm.
It's just some holy person centuries and centuries and centuries later finds something and says these are authoritative, and so I trust it.
Right.
And that doesn't mean like John Calvin speaks of how the sheep hear his voice. So you could read the scriptures and know they're the word of God.
Mhm.
I'm not going to say that's false. I'm not going to say we should reduce the scriptures categorically to what we could historically prove has authority and is early and yada, yada, yada. I mean, that doesn't speak to my heart. I don't think anyone's hearts are converted thinking that cold and rationally. But my point is that in isolation can be used for anything. It can be used for the Quran. It can be used for the Book of Mormon. But Christianity is more than this. It's right. It's not some sort of faith that comes out of nowhere. It comes with many witnesses, not just Muhammad, for example, not just Joseph Smith. It
Right.
comes with a historical continuation and with an even more profound note. It comes with all sorts of tiny little differences that aren't really all that important on a conceptual level, because you have lots of witnesses. If everyone saw a crime, you're going to get 10 different stories, a little different details, but a lot of overlap, which shows what people saw really occurred. Sorry, let's just make sure Theotokos didn't get hit too hard there. So that being said, right, so that actually shows the authority of the scriptures, that there are all sorts of tiny little differences, but overall agreement. But the same is true of apostolic doctrine. There could be all sorts of different glosses and stuff, but when you start seeing coalescing something that's largely the same, I'd argue orthodox, then it becomes something you got to pay attention to. Now, I think the most, to me, the most important, but also this would be the most, I don't know, epistemic of all these sort of things I'm laying out here, would be the consensus of the saints is a witness to the Holy Spirit. This is something that the early church took for granted. I cover this in Rise and Fall of the Papacy. It's the whole basis of conciliarism. It's the whole basis of the Vincentian canon. St. Vincent de Lérens saying the faith that was held everywhere, by everyone once and for all. That's the actual correct doctrine. And in fact, he uses this to discern what is correct in the scriptures and what's not, because all sorts of people could argue with the scriptures. This is how we ought to interpret it. So I didn't invent this criteria, but this isn't just St. Vincent's criteria. Everyone has this criteria in the early church that talks about it. Again, not everywhere talks about it. Just when they talk about it, this is what they're working with. It's an epistemology. There is no, hate to break it to anyone, but I'll just say there's no pope waving a magic wand in historical sources. Doesn't mean a pope can't wave a magic wand. It's just that we don't have that in the sources. There's no strict appeal that, the scriptures can't be confused, and so we can just argue with each other from the scriptures, and that will remove all confusion. That doesn't exist in the sources either. I mean, St. Irenaeus actually kind of avoids this by saying we could appeal to this succession of churches to show which churches have authority. Their interpretation's what's relevant. And so this is important because it actually gives us a sort of mostly fail-safe way, apart from our own sin and ignorance, to understand what's correct doctrine and what the scriptures actually teach. Because if there's a patristic consensus, that is the testimony of the Holy Spirit, and that's what gives it authority. Just like in Acts chapter 15, where the consensus of the apostles, the elders, which is just the priests and bishops, and the laity, because it says, everyone else, it seemed good to the Spirit and to us, is what it talks about in Acts chapter 15, I think verse 28. And so, because that's the case, when we see consensus, well, there goes the Theotokos.
No.
Sorry.
No, you're good, bro.
So, I didn't hear glass shatter, so that's a good thing, thank God. So, being that that's the case, we have some sort of good basis to go, we got to pay attention to this. And it's just not a matter of it's historically right. It's not a matter of it'd be good if it's true, because it would create sort of all sorts of other issues with the scriptures or whatever. It's actually a means of discerning things, right? That's why when we see Roman Catholics say we need an infallible interpreter of scriptures, because otherwise there's dogmatic confusion. We have an infallible interpreter, the consensus of the fathers, the consensus of Christians throughout time. That is our infallible interpreter. And if there's not a consensus, then we don't have that sort of clarity on a given topic. Yeah. And all of our communions have clarity in some things and not in others. So it's not because you have a means for clarity means everything will be perfectly solved. That's not the point.
Right.
The point is there is a means. It's not mysterious, right? When people say, well, how do Orthodox know? Like, we have a means. That doesn't mean I'm smart enough to, read all the fathers and come to the right consensus.
Sure.
Right. Just like I'm not smart to read the scriptures and come to the right thing, or I'm not smart enough to understand the papal ex cathedral statement. It doesn't fix us being stupid or us being unholy. Right. The point is we do have a criteria, and that's what it is.
Yeah. I think the thing that resonates with me most, and especially coming out of Protestantism, is you saying that the consensus of the saints being the witness of the Holy Spirit, right? Whereas you talk to 100 different Protestants, and I'm not trying to paint everybody with a broad brush. Like, I really don't like misrepresenting people, and because I don't want to be misrepresented, right? But I can tell you, Craig, I've talked to many Protestants that are telling me that the Holy Spirit is leading them in a particular direction that is complete opposite of someone else that the Holy Spirit is leading in that direction. And it's
Mhm.
just confusing ultimately. I'm just curious your thoughts on that. And I'm sure you've had engagement with different people that would say something similar. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd say like we'd be dishonest to say that Protestantism doesn't have this problem more than Roman Catholics and Orthodox, right? Roman Catholics and Orthodox have their own debates, but
Sure.
it would be dishonest to say our debates are more severe than what's within Protestantism,
Mhm.
right? And even if you take a branch of Protestantism like Presbyterianism, the Baptists, Anglicanism, their internal debates are still like fundamentally huge, over what has authority, whether, and other things that are important. So it's for that reason, it's a valid critique. It just shouldn't be taken too far because the Orthodox have their own debates.
Sure.
There's the debates over baptism on the orthosphere, like, correct form in baptism and stuff like that. With
Mhm.
the Roman Catholics, they have certain moral issues which are starting to become more of a um, issue of dogma than like it would be in the past. Because again, pretty highfalutin papal statements and documents that are problematic, which are forcing them to deal with these things. But the reality is, you go to one Roman Catholic church, you've been to most of them. Doesn't mean all of them, but they're
Sure.
fairly similar. There's strong overlap. And with the Orthodox, other than the aesthetic window dressing, like Greeks do things different than Russians, right? It'd
Hmm.
be like expecting a Roman Catholic church in Latin America is going to be like one in Ireland. That's not going to be the case. But
Right.
the ethos is going to be very similar.
Hmm.
But you just don't have that in Protestantism, and so we don't want to push that everything's solved too far. But there is a issue in Protestantism, and it's because ultimately speaking, the authority is the individual.
Right.
Now, it's not that individuals don't make judgment calls at all, or wrong judgment calls on all communions. Of course they do. But for at least on paper, the ultimate authority in Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy isn't the individual.
Hmm. Very well said. I appreciate that. All right, so going back then to Dionysius, we talked a little bit about what the Dionysian corpus is. My question now at this point is, what do most scholars, or I guess I should say, where do most scholars date Saint Dionysius writings to, and what would those dates be if the Dionysian corpus was authentic?
Now, most scholars, because the vast preponderance of scholarship rejects the authenticity of the Nicene corpus, doesn't mean all scholars. Father Dimitri Staniloy of blessed memory
Mm.
argued for their authenticity, and he published on this like in the late 1990s before he died. And so you can't say, oh, that's ancient history, or because he's Romanian doesn't count. I mean, he was published in the West too. I mean, he was a big, famous theologian
Hmm.
and published, patristic scholar. And so you can't say everyone didn't believe this. I mean, that's just not true. But the vast preponderance reject the authenticity of the Nicene corpus. They generally date it after 475. It's more in vogue as of late to say in the 520s. They almost want to make it seem like that certain writers, like Severus of Antioch, were initially unaware of the corpus's existence. And they use this to kind of make the case that it was fairly new in the 520s. And so what is without doubt is that it's within the 6th century that it almost becomes like popular,
Hmm.
right? And it's not that we don't ever see this. It's people will say like Shakespeare became bigger after he was dead than when he was alive, and we say this a lot with musicians and with artists. Like Picasso was bigger after he's dead than he was alive,
Right.
and stuff like that. So that kind of actually is pretty common in that, like, if you say that to someone casual conversation, it wouldn't like be strange to them. But this is way after Dionysius was alive. He became popular.
Yeah.
It's not the first time he's quoted, and this is something that recent peer-reviewed research is bringing to light. But it's the first time I'd say the general teeming masses care about him, and anyone. And I go, well, why? Just try reading Dionysius yourself. It's not easy reading, and you can see why this was not popular, and only very few people would have read this thing for so long. It
Mm.
seems to have become popular simply because the Christology was refreshing given the sort of arguments that were between Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. And so now all of a sudden, right, how do we get to solving this issue? They're looking to the saints, but the problem is the saints are almost too recent that we're talking about these Christological issues in the 5th century. So all of a sudden now Dionysius becomes this really good candidate for both sides and for different reasons. And so that's really what made him popular.
Because he's early. Is that what
because
you're saying?
he's early and because his Christology is so advanced, it helps address these sort of debates were happening in the 5th, 6th century. Because if a writer says something that becomes not all that relevant, they could be lost entirely. We lost Papias' writings, which is like he had quotations from Jesus, not in the scriptures, and he was writing decades after the scriptures. You can say he was wrong, but the point is, I would sure like to see what they were, other than the few that we have preserved, like from Irenaeus and Eusebius. So that stuff's nice. So like when people become less relevant in time, we could lose their writings. And that's probably why we even lost a few of Dionysius' writings. But sometimes the opposite, they become more relevant and all of a sudden we care about what they wrote more. So like a recent example of this is all of a sudden everyone wants to talk about St. Maximus. It's not that he wasn't important per se, but Protestants, like who's the scholar out of Minnesota? Paul Blowers. So it's not just like Orthodox. You have Dr. You got Dr. Blowers. You have Orthodox or Roman Catholics. All of a sudden, Maximus, like if Maximus said it, it's the most important thing ever. But if we even had this conversation 30 years ago, no one would have talked that way. Right. And none of this stuff would have been in English 30 years ago. Right. You know, so this is an example of how this kind of arcane writer, if you read Maximus, very confusing to read, could also become, he's important. You got to read this guy. And you go, really? You know, but it does happen. And how many centuries later was that for Maximus to have the second coming? You know, you don't see Maximus quoted that often, pretty much for most Orthodox history. The really smart people understand him in and out. The Damascene, Palamas, but he pretty much doesn't exist on the Roman Catholic side. None of their scholars cared about him. They weren't really translating him into Latin. And like they used the Damascene to understand Maximus' ideas. The Protestants didn't care about Maximus. So Maximus beats Dionysius for having this kind of second wind for his corpus, and we're living and seeing it, and so it's definitely not impossible. We have examples today like that.
Right. Well, and to that point, so I was a Protestant for 5.5 going on 6 years, and the first time I ever heard of St. Maximus the Confessor was whenever I stepped foot into the Orthodox Church. Like the fellowship hour after the fact, after the first Divine Liturgy I ever attended, these guys were all talking about St. Maximus the Confessor. I was like, who? Like, I never heard of this guy in my life. So just to your point. But Dale, my co-host, what is going on, brother? I see you got my email. How's your memorial?
Just got it now. Sorry I'm late. But yeah,
no, you're good.
Now, and I showed up. I hope I haven't missed about half an hour. Okay.
Yeah. We're getting ready to do question number 3 now. So
yeah, I didn't say anything that worthwhile the first 30 minutes, so I don't think you missed anything.
No. Well, you did say something that I'm going to follow up on here in just a second. But Dale, I know in Canada now, do you celebrate Memorial Day because you're so close with us, Americans, or this is just another weekend for you?
Yeah, Memorial Day is nothing. We had our special weekend, Victoria Day, last weekend, so that's our holiday in May.
It's just like Canada Day is like 3 days for the 4th of July. Like they have very close holidays.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's the same thing. Fireworks, friends, family, stuff like that. So, yeah.
Right on. Well, Dale, I'm glad you could make it. And if you got any follow-up, I mean, obviously, I don't think Craig would have any problems answering. But, yeah. So just as a follow-up to that last question I asked about the dates, Craig, I think I heard you say earlier, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you would date or that it seems that the Dionysian corpus is a little bit older than Revelation. Is that accurate? Okay.
It'd be accurate. It's the earliest possible date's the year 98 AD.
Wow. For the entire book.
For almost the entirety of the corpus, yes.
Wow.
Because there's certain internal details. And there'd be older books, because again, the books make mention of younger books. So you could have books that are maybe in the 80s and stuff like that. And it's oldest it could be. It depends. This is something where it's not published yet. It's still something that's being researched.
Okay.
But it could go as late as 110, 112. There's a certain philosophical work that there may be certain references within the Dionysian corpus too, and we could actually confidently date that book, and that might bring it that much later.
Okay.
This interestingly makes Dionysius at his youngest in his early to mid 80s, and his oldest in his late 90s. And so a lot of people start rolling their eyes that it's not possible for someone that old to write. I just remind them that, for example, we have scholars today like Dr. Evangelos Chrysos, who publishes a ton, and he's 86, I believe. So it's not like old guys can't write and don't have acuity. They do.
Right.
Now, I don't think I'm going to. I've lost a ton of steps. And I'm 39. So it's like, I don't think I'm going to have that sort of acuity in my 80s, but there's people with acuity in their 80s and 90s. And so evidently Dionysius would have been one of those people.
Right. I think Dell would be one of those people in your 80s and 90s. You're going to be writing, publishing, Dell?
If I can, then yes.
There you go.
But, it all depends on my health at that time, but it definitely can be done. I agree with that. Okay, well, so just up front, I'm going to be asking as a follow-up questions and stuff. I'll ask like stupid, superficial stuff because I've never even heard of this Dionysius guy until 2 seconds ago, right? So,
Cool.
I'm kind
You're in for a treat.
I come from a Protestant background, but so just kind of looking it up, the first thing I noticed just on a Wikipedia thing, since we are talking about the dating, is that most scholars don't think this is authentic. They call it the Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite. So since we're talking about dating, what are some of the arguments against the Orthodox perspective? Why do the majority of scholars think this wasn't written by him? It was some later fraud, basically.
Yeah, let's like I guess steelman the inauthenticity argument so that we could so people can understand the way of the land. Like we already said, it's a corpus that wasn't popular for centuries, right? We don't really hear from it and have it in its entirety into the 6th century. And so you would think, well, that'd be strange for an apostolic father. Why would this be so obscure for that long? And forgive me for refuting the points as I make them, because otherwise I won't remember them unless you guys are going to write them down for me. Other early apostolic fathers like St. Polycarp, St. Ignatius, they don't weigh that heavily in sources pretty much after the 2nd century. So it's not something where this is unheard of. In fact, we have other early writers like St. Athenagoras, where really he's totally lacking from the sources until the 9th century. St. Photius makes mention of him, if I remember right. So this is something that, or is that Aristides? I can't remember, but one of them, right? One of the 2nd century Athenian apologists that are Christians. And so, yes, it's something worth considering, but is it decisive in and of itself? No, right? It's curious, but it's not decisive. Another important argument that's made, and this is their strongest one historically, though I think the evidence is much weaker than people think, is simply that there's almost verbatim similarities between the pagan philosopher Proclus and Dionysius. And there's sort of trope that the Christianity is stupid, it's ignorant, it's not philosophically advanced. But as the pagans are converting to Christianity, they wanted to bring their advanced pagan highfalutin philosophy with them. And so the guys like Augustine brought in their Neoplatonism, but they really wanted to full-blown include all these Neoplatonist ideas into Christianity, and that pretty much inspired someone to copy Proclus and invent Dionysius. And we could already see there's a lot of assumptions made there, that there weren't good Christian philosophers, which is just not true. Like, for example, I think it is Athenagoras in a plea for Christians. He anticipates, who's that Scott? Is it Kant? I think it's Kant, the moral argument for the existence of God, right? So like if you study the history of philosophy, they would tell you it took it to the 1700s or something to come up with this, but it's not true. Athenagoras had the idea, right? And so that shows you he ain't that stupid, right? I mean, he came up with this idea that was meant as a response to these other arguments for the existence of God and those against it during the Enlightenment. And there's other examples of advanced philosophy.
You're talking about the categorical imperative kind of thing, right? In terms of Kant's moral argument.
Well, yeah, like the idea that we know of God's existence because otherwise there couldn't be ethics and morals. Okay. And essentially, so people are curious, Athenagoras makes an argument in order to prove the resurrection. So it's a very similar argument. Gotcha. But so anyway, that aside, to get into examples, the point is because there's verbatim similarity between Proclus, Dionysius, what we can't ignore is one of them copied the other. All right, one of them had to copy the other. And so if we discard with, well, Christians are too stupid to write something this smart, it gives us more of an equal playing field to determine who copied who. And I feel the evidence is decisive that Proclus copied Dionysius. I mean, for one, there's a passage where he quotes a external source, and the only external source that he's quoting is Dionysius. So we have something from Proclus where he says, this isn't from me, pretty much. I mean, this is a paraphrase, but he essentially says, it's not from me. And the only source we have that exists today, which has it, is Dionysius. So you think that alone would prove it, pretty much. But it's because this idea in scholarship's become so ingrained, people want more evidence than this. But we do have more evidence than this. We have earlier fathers in the 4th century quoting external authorities, and the only extant source with either verbatim terminology or with the same exact points being made in the book is Dionysius. Now, again, this doesn't prove there isn't a third source that is like Dionysius, all this stuff, and it's missing, right? That's theoretically possible. But we don't go with the more convoluted explanation. Like, we don't just say, well, there had to be some third thing and it's lost. We always work with, well, do we have something that exists that fits the bill? And we do. It's Dionysius. Other than that, I would say there's stronger arguments, and maybe this is giving up the ghost a little bit, but there's stronger arguments that Dionysius isn't after Proclus, but he's not the Dionysius of the 2nd century. He's an early 3rd century forgery. And that's more possible. It's more possible because Dionysius quotes the Clementine homilies, and there's scholarly debate over the dating of the Clementine homilies. Some scholarship allows for the Clementine homilies to be as early as 70 AD. So if that's true, obviously that's not a problem for Dionysian authenticity. But there's more scholarship. It's not quite the same like tidal wave we have in the whole Dionysian question, but there's more scholarship. They'll say that it's late 2nd, early 3rd century. And obviously that would disallow for the authenticity of the Dionysian corpus in that event. It would just be another, like we have with the Gnostics or we have with Orthodox, but hagiographic sources. It would just be another Christian source that names an apostle, but was written 100 years later, 80 years later, whatever the number would be, right? So that's not impossible. And I think a better argument could be had over that question than could be had over Proclus, which I feel the scholarship has just made egregious errors with that. I feel that Evangelos has really shown that to be the case. But a stronger, better discussion can be had whether this is a 1st, 2nd century source or late 2nd, early 3rd century source. For what it's worth, it's one that is explored in the article pending publishing right now. That is explored in detail.
So, yeah, thank you very much. Again, being new to this, I think it's helpful to get kind of the context of both sides. So, yeah, thank you for that. And back to Tyler's list.
So, so as a follow-up, and just so that everybody is on the same page, are we talking about the same Dionysius the Areopagite? And I would assume so, but that is mentioned in Acts 17:34.
Absolutely, same man.
Okay. I thought so. I was just making sure. Okay. So then on to my next question. So, and Craig, I know we've talked a little bit about your paper so far. So if this is going to be revealing too much, just say pass and I'll go to the next question. But you've recently mentioned to me, and you brought it up on this episode now, that you're currently working on a peer reviewed article arguing for the authenticity of the
Well,
Dionysian corpus. Yeah.
well, just to clarify, it is done and
Okay.
it is accepted. So it's just a matter of it being public.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So without then going into everything, that because obviously we want people to read it, and without revealing your entire hand, can you give us a little bit more argumentation that's going to be found in the paper, either for the authenticity of the Dionysian corpus or refuting or rebutting some of the anti or the pseudo Dionysian crowd?
Well, let me get to maybe we kind of covered some of these. We know that
Right.
Proclus quoted external authority. We know that Saint Jerome and Saint Gregory Nazianzus make reference to an external authority that matches Dionysius. The paper also goes over sources beginning in Alexandria in the early 3rd century or late 2nd century that consistently have linguistic correspondence with Dionysius. So either Dionysius copying all these sources, or those sources are copying Dionysius. The evidence more strongly points to those sources copying Dionysius because, depending on the writer, they copy it differently.
Mm-hmm.
While if it was just Dionysius copying everyone, they'd be copied the same way each time. But that's not the case. So we have that, even that without them citing anyone. We have just linguistic correspondence that's just too strong. And we're not talking about like those kind of cringe theories that Colossians is not a real Pauline epistle because it shares 2 words that are the same in Ephesians or something like that, right?
Right.
Or like, because I've read that sort of textual criticism. We're talking about where, like essentially sentences that are the same, or sentences of similar words that are making the exact same point, and it's a very obscure point at that. Right, stuff like that, where it's like obviously he got this idea from there. Now, there's really interesting stuff on the linguistic front, which points to the 1st century, because there's Attic Greek that's just out of circulation by the time you get to way past the mid-2nd century. It's just gone, but it's in the Nicene corpus, and this requires a sort of genius that'd be almost impossible to pull off today, let alone someone in the 5th century or 6th century, without the sort of critical understanding of text that we have with text criticism today. So the Greek is just too old otherwise to have been from a forgery. And it's just too well done and too subtle, and it has rhetorical conventions from Greek schools of thought, things that make sense with an Areopagite writing it, right? There's also, I would add certain things that people will cling to, like the term theurgy in Dionysius. And recent scholarship is really bringing to light that the term theurgy used by Dionysius has nothing in common with the pagan usage of the term. So it shows it's not like this sort of Neoplatonic borrowing, because it's almost like he's unaware what the Neoplatonists even mean by it, which makes sense if he lived before the Neoplatonists. Now, so what does theurgy mean? Like thea, we're talking about God, right? Urgy is like work. So theurgy is the work of God. Now, the theurgy as Dionysius uses it is the incarnation, right? The work of God was him becoming flesh. Now, what he means by theurgy, as the Neoplatonists mean, is a different term called heurgy, which is essentially our participation in the divine. Now, super boring, but for the Neoplatonists, it's all these mystical rituals where you could kind of manipulate the spiritual realm in order to like get unity with the one, which is their version of God. Heurgy is not a matter of mysticism in Dionysius, it's a matter of attending the liturgy and partaking in the sacraments, right? So it's like it drains all this mysticism out of it, but it's just pretty much authentic Orthodox Christian living, which makes sense because that's all he would have understood. So lot of this scholarship on the theurgy question just came out in the last like 7 years or so. So it's stuff that hasn't been seriously looked into when it comes to the question of Dionysian authenticity, because the scholarship just didn't exist until fairly recently.
Right.
Now, without boring you guys too much about it, I also get to like eternal things. Like there's eternal evidence which wouldn't seem right in a forgery, like Dionysius, for example, says that St. Timothy didn't understand what he was writing. Right. And so if you're making a forgery, you're not going to say other apostles don't get what you're talking about. It kind of makes it seem like you're crazy. but it's like a candid admission that could be made out of honesty from a real person. Like that, it's not weird in real life. It's weird in a forgery. So there's issues with that, and we get more to the Clementine homilies. And so that should be what you guys have to look forward to.
Right on. I appreciate that, Craig. And no, you're not boring me at all, or my audience, I don't think, because as soon as that's published, like, let me know, send me a link, whatever. I want to read it, and then probably maybe have you back on to discuss it a little bit more in depth. But Dell, I know you said that you had a follow-up.
Yeah, so I'm desperately so I'm on the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy now, kind of looking at the Dionysian corpus and stuff.
Dell is scrolling right now. Like, where can I get him?
Well, I'm trying my best to ask intelligent stuff, right? But
that's good. I love it.
Something related to what you brought up that I've seen here is that there is this Dionysian influence. Okay, it's had an impact on philosophy, mysticism, but also in the occult. And obviously, as Christians, I think even as an Orthodox Christian, the occult is bad. That's from Satan and stuff like that. So, in the first place, I'm just sort of curious what is the impact that this Dionysian corpus has had on related to the occult, and wouldn't that kind of speak against it being a proper Christian or Orthodox Christian writing or something?
Yeah, if it did, it would. The issue is this is where it's almost like you have to be part of that in crowd to get why they're on that wavelength and drawing these conclusions. Those who favor Dionysian inauthenticity often come from a philosophical vantage point. And so they have certain preconceptions about Neoplatonism, and they refuse to believe that there could be a Christian philosopher that anticipated Neoplatonist ideas but drew different applications. And so for that reason, they will say that Dionysius had to come after Neoplatonists. And this is an example of a word concept fallacy, where he uses the term theurgy, so he must be an occultist. But as I just pointed out, recent scholarship says it's just not true, right? And so some of the just online resources on the question, which are very intelligently written, it's backward, antiquated information. It's just not true.
Fair enough. Cool.
All right. So on to question 4 then. So you recently released a video with the other Paul discussing some of the things found within the Dionysian corpus that, if proven to be authentic, would, and this is my opinion as well, would just show how ancient our Orthodox tradition goes back. So I'll do question 4A here, and then I'll turn it over to Dell for 4B and let you answer kind of intermittently. But Craig, so can you discuss some of the theological and practical concepts found within the St. Dionysian corpus, and what would those things be that affirm things that Orthodox Christians, specifically Eastern Orthodox Christians, would hold to?
Yeah, the other Paul is a Anglican apologist. By all means, people should check him out. He does some real good stuff, good sense of humor. And it was a really interesting show because it played out sort of how I expected. Because a lot of things at Dionysius generally are not an issue for high church Protestants. So there's an altar. There's altars in the churches in Dionysius. There's bishops in the churches in Dionysius. They're baptizing infants in Dionysius. So it solves the whole Baptist question, right? If we have Dionysius and it's authentic attesting this, we could already get rid of the whole Southern Baptist Convention. They could all convert to something else, I guess, at this point.
Follow me.
If we're being serious to the evidence. But that being said, it's we have those, And then there's some that would be even problematic for an Anglican, but not impossible. So, for example, like prayers for the dead is something that does exist in Dionysius and does actually exist in Anglicanism, but the dogmatic or the doctrinal reasoning behind it is something that is much more consistent with orthodoxy than would be with what Anglicans have. And it's, if people remember from the show, the other Paul was like, all right, we could maybe make this work with time travel. And I don't say this to actually belittle the other Paul, because I actually remember sitting down with a bishop. It was called Beer in the Bible. It was a Friday night. And the bishops aren't married. So like he was talking to like 12 o'clock in the morning, and you could get interesting answers to questions when you're going that long, right?
There you go.
It's like St. Paul, when the guy fell out the window, he just kept going in the middle of the night. So it's one of those. And so that being said, someone asked him, well, how do prayers of the dead work? Right? In Orthodox, we just know they work, right? Like,
Sure.
they work. We do it, so it must work. But someone asks how, you start getting different answers to questions. And I've heard this from a bishop. I've also heard this from a monk. And they say, well, like God is outside of time. You pray for salvation of a loved one. We don't know what God could do for that person, in the past before it ever occurred, before you ever even prayed it. And again, like that's true. That's clearly not outside the power of God. And such an answer is completely compatible, I'd say, with any Protestant theology, right? Like if you pray for someone who's dead, but God could go back in time and make it where your Aunt Sally repented before she died, invisible to everyone, like that no point of theology gets ruined by that, right?
Mhm.
It would be stuff like purgatory, which again, because Dionysius could be used by Roman Catholics as well, right? If there's prayers for the dead and they're efficacious for the dead, well, that makes sense within purgatory too, right? Because they're essentially dealing with consequences of their sins from when they're alive, and then when you pray for them, they somehow, and we'll get to Roman Catholic theology, could deal with less consequences. Orthodoxy ultimately rejects purgatory in our conciliar documents, but doesn't really give very firm reason as to exactly how these prayers work. They just give some sort of relief, and they move the grace of God. And so this kind of speaks to something that's not just time travel, right? And by the way, I think it's a first century source. It's the Acts of Paul and Thecla. It's a hagiographic source, though, so don't go digging into it like it's actually accurate history. It's just a very early hagiographic source, meaning the saint life. It's like just so for the audience, it's like biographies of the saints, but they're not meant to be totally historically accurate. They're more meant to convey theological points. So it's between myth and history. It's like, if you understand what hagiography exactly is.
Mm-hmm.
So that being said, we know that those prayers brought relief to a dead loved one in that. And so this sort of time travel thesis is lacking in the sources, but this idea that it does something for the dead right now is in early sources, and it'd probably be the safest way to interpret what Dionysius talks about. Being that, right, we interpret early sources by other early sources, and if they say things very consistent, it's probably the strongest explanation of what's going on.
Right.
And so I bring this up because stuff that there's deal breakers for, let's say, Baptists or Presbyterians. The Presbyterian Church of Government's impossible with Dionysius. Baptismal theology is pretty much impossible with Dionysius. So they're pretty much out of here, but Lutheranism is possible technically, right? Anglicanism is possible technically. They would have to reform along Orthodox lines, and without making an epistemically certain argument why this should hold, I'll just say, why did this become Orthodox at that point? If you have to reform to be Orthodox, there already is an Orthodox church that didn't have centuries of just not taking this stuff seriously. We already have it. And it's true on other questions. For example, Dionysius very explicitly says the Father is the sole cause of the Holy Spirit, right? So there goes Roman Catholicism. Now, just people aware, Jesuits were well aware of this passage, and just like they're well aware of Maximus today, there's ways of really stretching at reinterpreting these passages. But the plainest interpretation disallows for the filioque, for example. the Platonist interpretation of let's say Dionysius has the energy essence distinction. So like now you actually have to care about that stuff in Maximus and that stuff in Palamas, because we have someone saying Paul knew that was well aware of it. And by the way, the Clementine homilies are also very well versed in the energy essence distinction, as is Theophilus of Antioch. This was something that people were they were very knowledgeable about in the first and second centuries. There's no doubt about that. But now, right, no Anglican or Protestant ever talks about energy essence distinction. Now you have to talk about it. Now you actually have to care about it.
Right.
And so it's a game changer. Is it game over for all Protestantism? No, but it's game over for a lot of Protestants. And this is what the other Paul said and agreed with. And it's also requires reform among the Protestants already there. And so this is why I would encourage Protestant listeners to do a serious investigation to the evidence of Dionysian authenticity, because it is that important, right? It's just like knowing what the Essenes were with the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's important too, so we can understand where scriptures come from.
Right.
Because the authenticity of the Dionysian corpus does change the whole game. That it does do. Even if it's not game over, it changes the game.
I appreciate that, Craig. Dale, I know you was trying to jump in there for just a second. If you want to go ahead and follow up, and then I've got to follow up because Craig read my mind without even knowing about this. I added this question like 10 minutes before we went live, and so you nailed it, bro, just then. So, but go ahead, Dale, and I'll jump in here in a minute.
Yeah, no, I didn't have a follow-up. I guess it actually fits perfectly with your question 4B, because I was just kind of jokingly saying, present, here I am. I'm the Baptist, so you're talking to me here.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know.
No worries. No, it's good, right? But yeah, I think I would personally. So I don't know if I would agree that it's game over for Protestantism, even if we accept it as authentic. Certainly, certain doctrines would need to be reformed and stuff like that, or at least reconsidered, because I don't think that just because one person says something. I mean, obviously with infant baptism, I've studied with an expert in church history, Dr. Tony Costa, and all the other sources don't teach infant baptism in the early thing. So there could be an argument there, I would say, even if it is authentic. But that's where I'm kind of curious about with question 4B here is I want you to kind of discuss, and I know you've already done it, but some of these concepts that would be problematic for Protestant theology and practice. Okay, well, because you've already talked about it, let me ask this. Do you think that it could be possible for Protestantism, like, for example, the solas to be true, even if, okay, infant baptism is true and the Eucharist is kind of along the lines of the Orthodox and stuff? Could anything be salvaged from Protestant theology, or is it totally game over for everything?
I find the solas to be a wax nose, and I don't say that to then actually denigrate the solas, but like a way a high church Anglican understands the solas, or a magisterial Protestant understands solas, very different than a low church Baptist understands the solas. So it's not game over for the solas for let's say a high church Anglican. Dionysius nowhere says, let's say faith alone doesn't save. It's because it's not something that's important to him, for example, right? He's not talking about that. The existence of prayers of the dead don't dispute faith alone for the Anglicans or the Methodists, and certain Lutherans, because they use them, right? So again, it has to do with the sort of weight you put on the solas. And I think the solas are more kind of like slogans, if that makes sense. They're not very useful theological guides. I think they're kind of advertising slogans. And so they could be true and they could be false. It's all based on emphasis, I think. Before people take me out of context, right? Like where I say, well, how can they be true? They can be false. Well, first on a theoretical level, but two, let's say, faith alone saves. The faith that has works does save. So it's all how you frame the question, I think. And so we argue so much over words. It's much more important to deal with concepts. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, the real answer to your question. The ethos and conceptual understandings of Dionysius are very foreign from Protestantism. Not in a way that's an objectionable, perhaps, in a way that's different, but they're not for orthodoxy. And I think that's the way we got to look at this, as in what is the Christianity of Dionysius? Does that Christianity exist? And it does. More of a hot button question as of late is iconodulia. And I really do feel that with Dionysius, we have iconodulia and its theological rationale explained. For what it's worth, you could also be a stickler with candles in church, because Dionysius says candles are necessary for worship. So people can make an argument that he's speaking in a general sense, that we need these, we need the icons and candles and all these different things for worship in a general sense, and he's not going to go to the, to the extent of the anathemas of Nicaea too. Fair enough, but at least we got to deal with, at least we have a apostolic father saying, yes, this is necessary, and that's consistent with the church saying, because this is necessary, it's anathema for you to say it's not, right? Because who would say the scriptures, you don't need the Holy Bible, right? Well, is that worth anathematizing over? Because they are necessary. Isn't someone saying anything that's necessary is unnecessary bad, right? And so I do think Dionysius does pose issues. They're not insurmountable with the right reinterpretations and retranslations. But I think to anyone honest, he poses a real issue because conceptually, he's just so much different than Western Christianity that goes for Roman Catholicism and for Protestantism.
Just to quickly clarify, so
yeah,
you think
go ahead.
His best fits in an Orthodox context rather than Protestant, and you mentioned kind of examples of like church practices and stuff. Do you also think that's the same with like doctrines? Because doctrines, yes, okay.
Same with doctrines. I would even not say this would be a decisive difference between Eastern Oriental Orthodox. But the emphasis in Dionysius, like let's say energy essence distinction, is obviously something more important in Eastern Orthodox theology than Oriental Orthodox theology. That's not that it's absent from Oriental Orthodox theology. It's just that they've lacked the same eternal controversies where that became as important. But the fact of the matter is, ultimately speaking, the different orthodoxies, which are extant today, really fit totally well with Dionysius. They don't need to reinterpret Dionysius. I'd say, other than there's one point, and this would be a show on its own, so that's why I don't want to get into details. But there's one point where I'd say Dionysius offers a difficulty just taking it at face value. And I think at least the first way we should read anything is at face value. Doesn't mean it's right, but you should get a good, honest sense of how it just sounds, right? You see with the scriptures or anything else. Where Dionysius appears to justify praying for the dead, the praying to the saints, praying to the dead, to the saints. But he only will name Old Testament saints. And so this kind of creates an issue for the Orthodox if we just take it at face value. Why not? There's New Testament martyrs. Peter and Paul were dead. He could have prayed to them. Why not? The Theotokos as well. Why not? And it's something where we could give answers. I could give reasons, right? Like Dionysius was there when the Theotokos died. Dionysius knew St. Paul, right? We know from a different Dionysius in Corinth that St. Peter visited Corinth. So maybe Dionysius actually saw St. Peter on the way through Greece and he traveled through Athens or something like that. We know that Dionysius had personal correspondence with John and other saints. So maybe it sort of was strange at that time to pray to saints that you actually knew in the flesh. But today, that's not as strange. It's rare. Most saints take way past everyone's lifetime to be canonized, right? Like everyone likes Saint Seraphim Sarov. He was canonized way after everyone who knew him was dead, right? So technically, you couldn't be canonizing him, but there were already people praying to certain saints. Like people pray to saints like Father Daniel Sazoyev now, and he's not canonized yet. And so it's sort of like, well, is this because they weren't praying to New Testament saints and only Old Testament saints? Or was Dionysius, because he's a bishop, not saying anything official about saints that weren't canonized? As you know, and again, canonization is a bit of an anachronism, as they would have understood canonization. That's a good question. It's not that we lack, for example, pre-Nicene prayers to saints. We do have them. We have sources, I think something like 13 of them from the first 200 years of church history. So it's not like a tiny amount. Like we have them. It's just in Dionysius, we would be interpreting Dionysius according to those sources, not him in isolation on that. And it could pose a problem. Keywords could. I don't think it does, but at least it can. And so that should be true of any early source, or being honest with it. It's not always worded the way any of us would like it, but I think we'd be dishonest to say most of everything in Dionysius would make perfect sense in modern Oriental and Eastern Orthodoxy, for example.
So thank you so much. Over to you, Tyler, for question 5, if you want.
Dale, I just want to ask you, Dale, and you know who I'm talking about whenever I bring this subject up. Craig and I were talking about this a little bit before we went live. But do you think, like, so say we have like records, and because we're talking about Saint Dionysius here, that if he was authentic, his writings were authentic, obviously, and he says something about baptism being essential for salvation in whatever way we take that. Do you think that that would pose a problem for, and I won't mention his name, but you know who I'm talking about, our friend that would say that baptism is optional, in a very, in a sense, even in which, like, I was a Protestant, I would reject that. I think you've told me that you've rejected. Do you think that that would pose a problem for people like that on that side of the coin? Or not so much?
It could, right? So because what you guys are saying by authentic, you're meaning like this is someone mentioned in Acts, right? And he's the one that wrote it. So he would have definitely been an eyewitness to the apostles themselves. So I think that there's, and when did he write this? If it's authentic, when did he write this? Like, when is that?
About 98 AD to 110 AD.
Okay, so around the same time as Clement of Rome. Okay, and so I think it has historical value. Again, I don't think it's just an ironclad proof, because people got things wrong. Peter was an eyewitness to Jesus, and he screwed up within 5 minutes on the spot. So I would also want to look at others. Do we have multiple independent attestation teaching this infant baptism? And my understanding is we don't have that from what I've learned of church history and stuff. But yeah, so I don't think I would say it's, just because this guy says it, that okay, it's game over for Phil Bears, who you're talking about there, our mutual friend. But at the same
You
time,
said it. I was going to keep him private.
Well, he reveals his position publicly. He's not ashamed.
Well, that's true. That is true.
But yeah, so at the same time, the way he handles that, I wouldn't be just as instantly dismissive either. No, this is first century historical document. I would treat it the same way I would Josephus or Clement of Rome or something like that, and seriously consider it and see what is entailed by that in terms of which doctrines would be true or inspired and stuff like that.
One thing to at least give people some reason to look at Dionysius more than just a solitary historical source is who he's writing to. Not only he writes to Titus, he writes to Timothy, he writes to John. So pretty much all the living apostles that are left are talking to him. And so this implies this isn't a random Diotrephes from the early church or Simon Magnus or someone like that. Like, this is someone who is on the same level with we would say the totally trustworthy authorities left. Right. And so, of course, it gets to, well, how about the personal fallibility of an apostle, right? Other than when they're writing scripture, could they make mistakes? And clearly, yes, we see St. Paul thinks nothing of correcting St. Peter in Galatians and stuff like that. But again, it does show like this is a source of significance because he knows the who's who of the church of that day, and that who's who writes our scriptures. So it is very important. I'm not saying you were talking against that. It was just to clarify for the audience.
No, I appreciate it. Go ahead, Dale.
Oh no, I was just saying, cool. Yeah, no, thank you for your thoughts. Did that answer your question there, Tyler?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I just, for my personal take, and Craig, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on this. Like, it would seem like what would authenticate Dionysius even more is that if Christians held to what he believed, decades and then even centuries after the fact. And I would argue that infant baptism is found in throughout the church fathers, and I'm sure you would too. And maybe we could do a show on that one day, to lay out the sources for infant baptism on that. But to my point, whether it's infant baptism or the Eucharist, the real presence of Christ, whatever, if the church is following or seems to be following what an early source wrote, that would seem to give it more weight, with it being authentic. Would you agree or disagree with that, Craig?
I would just say, like, we don't have any source that says we only baptize believers. Right?
Mhm.
That's, you sort of would need that in order to prove the point. Do we have sources that say believers are baptized? Of course. I mean, Christianity is a religion of converting people, but it actually doesn't prove the point. Now, we do have sources saying that we do baptize children. So we already have our criteria where at most these are implicit believers. And so we have explicit sources that say that children are baptized. And we have other sources explicit saying believers are baptized, but not at the exclusion of children. And so my argument would be historically the safest answer would be the one that could be consistent with the whole.
Mhm.
And the believers only, and I've read Everett Ferguson, by the way, he's definitely the best work on this topic. You'd be stupid not to read Everett Ferguson on this question if you're studying early baptism. But that being said, it's the strongest early infant related sources are Dionysius, obviously, Origen, but again, he's just writing as a private person pretty much. And then we have, I think the strongest is, other than Dionysius, is Saint Cyprian, because Cyprian is writing from a conciliar document. So it's not just him, right? He's writing to a whole audience of bishops
Mhm.
in the mid third century. And so that kind of, that'd be equivalent to finding 90 letters from the mid third century saying we baptize children, because it's the opinion of 90 bishops in Africa. So this is not some random thing. Now, that's not to mean, though, that the believer's baptism view isn't very strong in the church to the point where it could create legitimate confusion, particularly in the fourth century, where pretty much, I like saying this to people: name a single saint born before the year 400 that was baptized as a child. One. You can't find it. Doesn't exist. And we have tons of saints with Christian parents. Jerome had Christian parents. Augustine had, his mother is definitely Christian. His father was, I believe, a more lackluster Christian, but not, entirely not a Christian. But that's a debate. That'd be a minority view, by the way. Saint Ambrose had Christian parents. We have lots of saints with Christian parents, but none of them are baptized until they're adults. And so for the Baptists to see that, they go, well, like, that proves our point. And it proves something. It definitely does. It's very hard to reconcile with earlier sources that show that children are baptized. My personal opinion is it's a sort of heteropraxy, which is why it didn't prevail over time. And we can't take fathers that don't mention when they're baptized and then know categorically that means that they're only baptized years later. We just don't know. But again, right, it does mean something if the only explicit source is mostly in the fourth century. We do know that they're baptized only as adults. And it does seem to be because of the seriousness of sins that people wanted to put off their baptisms. So it's an interesting question. And this is why, even with Baptists, I'm not going to say on that question, they have more rope on that question than people think they do in the apologetics world. They have very strong arguments from the ancient sources. I'm not convinced by them, but they're strong arguments.
Right on. Thank you for that, Craig. I appreciate it. Dale, I know you said you had a follow up.
Yeah, just kind of following through with this. I want to kind of put it together to you because so I hear what you're saying in terms of the significance of this source and that. But I'm kind of wondering, so I know that I think I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Orthodox position would reject what Papias said about the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew. where the original was written in Aramaic by Matthew, and then the gospel we have, the Greek version, wasn't actually written by the Apostle Matthew himself. But we have this early source, Papias, and I believe we can date that even before Dionysius. This, when he wrote this, it was around 80 AD, kind of thing for this fragment. But at the same time, you guys are rejecting that Papias. Like, how should we treat Papias then? Why would you reject that and not see the same significance in something like that?
I actually wouldn't personally reject that. I'm not sure what saint would. There is a Septuagint primacy sort of view of the Old Testament. One that I wouldn't apply across the board, by the way. I do think the Book of Job is most reliable in the Masoretic text. But that is the majority Orthodox view, just to kind of uncritically accept the Septuagint. And then, to be fair, it's because Septuagint is more accurate most of the time. So there's a logic to it. I wouldn't say all the time, though. We don't have the Aramaic version of the Gospel of Matthew anymore. And so I think that's more the issue. If we had a authentic version which people trusted, I don't think there'd be any question that they'd want to rely on the original one.
Just so I understand, is this the official Orthodox position? You guys accept Papias' statement about the gospel, or is this just like you?
It's we have saints that accept it, like Saint Irenaeus, for example. And if I were to bet, if I read the Saint Life of Saint Matthew, I'll Google that while you're doing a question or something. I would bet it mentions it was originally written either in Hebrew or Aramaic. So I don't think it's an issue for us, especially if we had put that in the Saint Life from Matthew.
All right, cool. I stand corrected. Yeah, I learned something new. So, all right, cool. Thank you.
Hey, and look, Dale, that's why we do Faith and Altar episodes, and why everybody should, if you have not yet, subscribe to the Faith and Altar channel. You are almost guaranteed to learn something new. But with that being said, while Craig's looking that up, I will make a couple announcements. So if we are, for those who don't know, we are currently doing a fundraiser for funds to build a website, and that is strictly for our audio. So right now we'll do our audio on this website so we can have a backup place. We use YouTube majorly to upload our video and audio content, but we always would like to have a backup. And so that's what we're currently fundraising for now. If you would like to help us with that endeavor so we can get our own faithandaltar.com website, and then currently, add to it, like we want to eventually, put a shop on there, and just different things we'll add to it over time. So right now, that goal is $1,000. That's $200, and I'll be completely transparent with my audience. That is $200 for the hosting fee, so that will be yearly, which I think we can do that with the donations that we currently get yearly. I'm not worried about that. But then $800 will go to the web developer. And so if you would like to donate to that, please see our link tree in the description below, and then that will take you not only to all of our links, our Facebook, our Gmail, but also everywhere you can donate. We currently take PayPal, Cash App, and Venmo, and I'm encouraging people, like, we also take YouTube donations, so like super chats, super thanks, things like that, super stickers. But I will say YouTube does take 30% of that. And so I would encourage people to, if you're going to donate to that cause, we're not saying we're not going to take YouTube donations. Obviously, we will. But if you would like to get more bang for your buck, please donate to us, Cash App, Venmo, or PayPal. They don't take nearly as much as that. I think Cash App's like 2% or something, and that's if you instantly transfer it. If it's not an instant transfer, it's free. You just have to wait a couple business days to go to your account, so to your bank account. So anyway, I just wanted to make that a quick announcement. And Craig, if you have that, are you ready to, or do I need to keep rambling?
On November 16th, this day we commemorate the Apostle Matthew. In his saint's life, it says, in the order of the books of the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew comes first. Palestine is said to be the place of the writing of the Gospel. The Gospel was written by St. Matthew in the year 42 AD, after the birth of Christ, in his native Jewish language, then translated into Greek. The Hebrew text survived for us, but many of the linguistic, cultural, historical peculiarities of the Greek translation remind of it. So there you go.
Right on. Dale, does that answer your question, brother?
Oh, Yeah, I was happy with what Craig answered before on Matthew. It was just news to me. I thought the Orthodox position was not Appius, so that okay. My point fell through there, but yeah.
And Craig, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but to my understanding, there are certain things like within orthodoxy, like that people can, I don't want to say disagree with, but have differencing of opinions on. It everything that is stated is not necessarily dogma. Do you want to add to that just for clarification purposes, Craig, on the orthodox position of that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would just say that the Orthodox faith is a revealed faith, the faith given once for all by the saints, as Jude talks about. And the West doesn't approach theology that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I bring this up because we're so used to like asking theological questions, demanding theological resolutions. That's what these YouTube channels are about, right?
Right.
But if you look at historically what the faith was, that's not how people live their faith. They just they receive it, they experience it, they live it, and right, reading the scriptures, attending the services, doing the works of a Christian. And so this idea that like, oh, that there's theological opinions that are binding, they're not binding. Like no one talked this way back then, because I guess when you're this close to starvation, you're not really that worried about, can we pose problems and then make resolutions of problems that no one thought of yet?
Right.
Right. Just so people are aware, in scholastic theology, that's actually possible. It's a whole approach where you could do that through inferential reasoning. But it's just, that's not what you see in the first 1,000 years of church. No one did theology that way. Certainly not in scripture. It's not how they treat, doctrine. It's treated as revealed and preserved. And so I say this because, you could pose a question, well, isn't Apapius a problem for you? And it would be, if I were just a normal Orthodox Christian, go, well, he's a saint. We revere him. Saint's life doesn't warn about him. So why would he be a problem, right? So it only becomes a problem when it's made a problem. So people aware it could be made a problem, that even early church writers like Eusebius didn't like the sort of literal takes that people would derive from some of the parables of Jesus related by I was going to say Polycarp, but by Papias. But all that proves is maybe the problems in interpretation, not what was said, right? We know from Christ's parables, they're not very straightforward sometimes, and that's part of the reason why you actually need the apostles to interpret these parables. So I just remind people of that. It's, I wouldn't say Papias is a problem, and theological opinions aren't necessarily a problem, because like, in the end of the day, it's more what we're doing on a daily basis. What we shouldn't be doing is just philosophizing and creating questions to things that really don't need resolution.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think there's certain things, obviously, like the creed, for example. If you disagree with the creed, you're not going to be considered orthodox, right? But at the same time, there are differences of opinion. I mean, for example, I was reading two different interpretations or two different answers for the question, well, does Jesus know the time or the hour? And I read St. Basil and St. Chrysostom, that says completely different things. Now, are they contradictory? No, but I think they build on each other whenever it comes to the interpretation that the apostles gave. With that being said, I think there's disagreements everywhere you look, but at the same time, I just bring that up to say, yes, there's dogma within the Orthodox Church and there's opinion. And so I don't think we need to be fighting. We don't disfellowship over certain things anyway. When there is a disagreement. And so I think that's good personally.
There's a sort of fear of like just reading the Bible and just giving an interpretation as if, well, unless some earlier saint wrote this exact same thing, I'm doing something wrong. Well, then how did the first saint write about it?
Right.
Right. So it's like you need to be able to give interpretations and have opinions. And ultimately speaking, it's whether there's consensus over these opinions or not. Is the Spirit clarifying, yes, this is true. And if it's not, there will be no consensus, and we don't have to worry about it.
Right.
I have an unpublished manuscript on an interpretation of the Book of Job, and I pretty much make a quick apology in the introduction that, like, listen, I'm not slave, because there's already an Oriental Orthodox scholar already made a interpretation of the Book of Job, which it gives every interpretation Saint ever gives in every single passage. I go, this is not that sort of book. I'm giving you my interpretation. from the Book of Job, and this is something that sadly is kind of rare in modern Orthodox circles. And there's reasons for that, because why would you trust my opinion? You would want someone who's holier than me, like a monastic or some great saint, great evangelist like Father Dionysius the Areopagite, who has all sorts of biblical commentaries. He's a married man, so right, he's not some ascetic, but right, you'd want someone really saintly, not Craig Truglia, giving that interpretation. So I could see the reticence, but there's also, in my opinion, we've always had Christians giving interpretations of the scriptures. So if it's good and it benefits people, great. If it's not, then whatever. We could give interpretations. But what governs it, any of these interpretations, is that they're consistent to teaching the church in all these questions.
Right.
And to be fair, Protestants don't say this, but did say the same. They really do the same thing. They're not going to read some passage isolation and then reject Trinitarianism. Right. Like they are guided by a sort of meta tradition as well. So it's the same process, just obviously Orthodox to be more pigeonholed. We have a more clarified, crystallized tradition than maybe what Protestantism as a mass movement has.
Right. Right on. I appreciate that, Craig. Thank you. All right. So the last question on the list, and then I've got a follow up to what you said earlier about the essence and energies distinction. That was fantastic, by the way. But so in your interview, and I know I'm going to butcher this last name, so please help me out with this. But with Evangelos
Nikitopoulos.
Thank you. So Evangelos mentioned that 90% of the references to Saint Dionysius were from Alexandrian sources. And my question is just straight up, does this add weight to the claims of authenticity? And if so, how so?
It generally does, if we do like a 60-40 thing, simply because it'd be weird for a forger just to care about one locality. But it's not weird if that's the locality that preserved the text. This is a very, the Dionysian corpus, I welcome people to read it. It's very dense. You can see why wouldn't it be a bestseller, at least not originally, right? And so who could read this thing? Well, it makes sense that the philosophical Christian school in Alexandria would. They probably, used it as a textbook of sorts. And so that makes sense. And so the Alexandrian connection makes it less likely for a forger, because a forger would probably be more liberal and borrowing from everywhere, not just focusing arbitrarily on locality. Like if you're gonna just focus on one locality, why not Greece? Right? That's closer to where Dionysius was.
It is closer
than Alexandria, right? So it's like it makes more sense for authenticity and the preservation of the text. That it wasn't a big seller, but there was the school in Alexandria was started by an Athenian. So it makes sense he would have took it with him, and that's the only, and probably the original took it with him, and they didn't make tons of copies because it wasn't that popular.
Right on. All right, Dale. Actually, before I go to Dale, with a follow up, I want to say so the audience, if you have a question, and I just posted this below, but I don't know if anybody saw it or not. But if you have a question for me, for Dale, for Craig, please go ahead and put that. If you would, put at Faith Unaltered just so I see it. It kind of pops up orange and stands out. Also, super chats get priority as always. If you decide to donate to us via super chat, obviously we're going to put your question right at the top of the list, and so it will take priority. But if anybody does have a question for us, you can go ahead and start putting them in now. And I will turn it over to Dale if he's got any follow-ups. And if not, I'll ask my last question, and then we'll get to the audience questions. But Dale, anything from you, brother?
Follow-ups on this particular question. So yeah, I'm happy to give it back straight over to you for your follow-up.
Hey, we'll play the volley thing. I don't care. That's cool with me. So, fair enough. So we've touched on this, and I find it absolutely fascinating. I was talking and interviewing Dr. David Bradshaw, and just a quick plug, if nobody's seen that, or if you haven't seen that, I should say, go ahead and check that out right after this, because that was a fantastic discussion. So we did 2 interviews with Dr. David Bradshaw, one specifically on the essence and energies distinction. What is it? Basically just a summary and a basic intro into what the essence and energies distinction is. And then our next one This actually came after a conversation that Dell, myself, and my other co-host David Russell had with Dr. William Lane Craig on the subject of philosophy of time. And so we brought Dr. David Bradshaw on to give that view. So, what is the philosophy of time from an Orthodox perspective? And how that connects into this conversation is that Dr. Bradshaw referenced Dionysius in this conversation. Actually, I think it was in both conversations, if I'm not mistaken, and talks about how St. Dionysius talks about the processions, right? Like God's procession specifically. And I asked him, well, that sounds a lot like St. Gregory Palamas's essence and energies distinction. And he confirmed that. He said, absolutely, I believe that. I think that that's exactly what Dionysius is referring to. And so with that being said, I think, and this is where I want to get your opinion, Craig, is that if that's what specifically St. Dionysius is talking about, one, I think it shows this doctrinal development thing that takes, centuries. I don't think that's there, first of all, if that's what he means by processions. But let me just get your opinion on that first, and then I'll follow up.
I am not too well versed in the philosophical questions.
Okay.
I just say, as a matter generally, that we have in Acts chapter 17 a Dionysius the Areopagite. Mm-hmm. That's how he's identified. And St. Paul's there pretty much dealing with the philosophers, and everyone wants to hear something new, like it says in Acts chapter 17. And he, out of all the people he converts, is the philosophical expert there, the Areopagite, to kind of judge. It's like a philosopher judge, if you know what an Areopagite is. Mm-hmm. So wouldn't it make sense that this person wouldn't just stop writing, stop thinking about philosophy, stop thinking about anything it feels, intellectual, right? Of course, he would have done all those things. That doesn't mean that same person's corpus what we have today, but it is awfully consistent that if that person would have wrote a corpus, it would have pretty much been what we have. Very advanced philosophically, very well thought out on these questions. And so I say this because it's not a matter of doctrinal development, because not only do we have this as a revealed part of the faith, we have very early on someone who would have thought about this stuff very carefully in the lens of all these philosophical conundrums, which are age-old questions. And he deals with these things. So I would say Dr. Bradshaw would be correct on this. And I know that the Sixth Ecumenical Council, as well as the Council of Constantinople in 1351, which is on the energy essence distinction question, they lean on Dionysius, and it makes sense because Dionysius is firm on this question.
Right on. And then just my follow-up to that, I think, and you've alluded to this a little bit in the past of this episode, or a little bit earlier in this episode, but if Dionysius is doing an essence and energies distinction, whether that's game over for Protestantism or not is one thing, I think, but I really believe that in and of itself should probe people that don't hold to an essence and energies distinction to look kind of further into that doctrine and really try to, weed out like the differences of opinion amongst Protestants and Roman Catholics. I think that would give great weight to the essence and energies distinction. And I'm just curious about your opinion on that as well.
Well, yeah, it's like I said, it makes it a thing. You're gonna have to deal with this.
Yeah.
And you can't ignore it. And then it begs the question, why reform along Orthodox lines when it could just be Orthodox? What is so objectionable in Orthodoxy then? And then this is where we have to get to the questions of, generally for people, it's prayers to saints and icons. Mm-hmm. And we kind of have those things in the Nicene Corpus, so that you sort of start running out of reasons, I think, other than all the corruption and bad things that exist within Orthodox Church. It's like you could, I'm never a fan of that stuff because people point out, there's all sorts of criminal activities in Southern Baptist Convention or in the Roman Catholic Church. Like anything big's got problems.
Right.
Let's screw up people. That's reality. I mean, that's good reason to be jaded with something or not maybe give them your money. Mm-hmm. Right. You want to know where your money is going to go. I understand that. But that being said, it's for theological reasons, you start running out of reasons, I think, right, especially with the authenticity of the Nicene Corpus.
Right. Right on. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, Dell, any follow up to that before we go to the audience questions? And Craig, I just want to say something to you real quick too. Hang out after this. I've got one thing for you after we get off of here, and I want to talk to you about your book. So,
Sounds good.
with that being said, yeah. All right, Dell, any follow up?
No follow-up questions. I think we've done shows with David Bradshaw and stuff on the essence energies distinction. Obviously,
Yeah.
I mean, in one sense, as a Protestant, it's undeniable that the Bible speaks of energies or work, which is what that word means. So I do take a synergistic position in terms of at least sanctification. I think that's, you guys have proven that's undeniable. So I've come around on that. I would still claim to be monergistic in a certain sense when it comes to justification. Like I'm strict on that. In terms of the essence energy distinction, as a philosopher, I'm still not comfortable with the full doctrine that the Orthodox, I think they go too far where they try to, I take more of a modern, contemporary, analytic philosopher perspective, right? Like God is a substance. He has an individual essence. He has a divine nature. So he has all of the essential properties essential for being a divine kind of thing. He has certain contingent properties as well, such as acquiring a human nature. Okay, great. One of the divine persons and stuff like that. And in terms of his, he has certain causal powers that are a part of his essence and stuff like that. And those constitute, when he actualizes some of those are actions that God does, either miraculous or otherwise in the world. So, like I have no problem with talking about God's energies, and that he does actions, he does works in the world of various kinds, and he has the power to do that. But I wouldn't define that along the Neoplatonic lines of energies, essence, distinction. I think you guys go too far. And I think if I'm not mistaken, I think the reason for that is because you guys want this element of mysticism, which I find baffling as a Protestant. I don't like that. I think it's the opposite. We want divine revelation. We want to know. I mean, we're made in the image of God. We have certain certain properties that God has that are essential to him as well, right? For example, our rational things, we know exactly what it means to have a mind. It's the same with God. And to be a free will agent, our free will is exactly the same as God's free will. These are things that are inherent to God as a person that can't be described as energies or actions, in my opinion. So that's kind of my take. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think I get exactly where you're coming from, Dell. I mean, I disagree, but I definitely get where you're coming from. I think that's a good thing, right? So that's what we're always trying to tote here on Faith Unaltered, is that even if we disagree on things, and we bring many people who disagree with us on certain things, and I don't think if Faith Unaltered wouldn't exist if we didn't have people like as co-hosts that agreed with everything the other agreed with. You know what I mean? But I do want to give Craig a chance to respond to that, and then we'll go if you'd like to, and then we'll go to the audience questions.
Yeah, it's it's a matter of consensus within the church for the longest time that that every essence has a energy and a will, presuming that like it's something that could be sentient, right? Like God, humanity, animals, things like that. They have essence, energy, and a will. So the idea that like that would conflate energy and essence and energy and will just doesn't make sense how the whole church understood it. But the scriptures really don't touch on that as explicitly as people think. I kind of covered this in my show with the other Paul. I would just say people want to really look into it. Look at Ephesians chapter 3 and look at the Greek, because you will see that the grace of God's being called energies there. And so now we got to start dealing with this, because St. Paul is the steward of God's grace. He's steward of God's energy. He's not steward of essence. How could he be? Right. So we have this in the scriptures, and I think what we have in Dionysius is a full expression of its relevance.
Right on. Well said. Thank you, Craig. Dale, I saw you on mute there for a second.
Well, no, he was meant to get the last verse, but I'm just kind of curious, like, just very quickly, like, I think it's confusing when you call it energies? Why don't you just call them works or actions? Like, is the
You could. It's the same. Yeah, that's just like if you were to talk about this question 100 years ago, everyone called them operations.
Mm.
Um, I actually prefer energies, and I don't prefer all translations, and I'll tell you why. Because the word synergy makes sense, right? You're working with God, synergy, and for that reason, because synergy is a firm theological term in the West, it makes sense to continue talking about energy essence for that reason, because the term synergy, if we didn't use the term uh, synergy, it would be an issue. Like sometimes I will even say cooperate, co-energize. I'll say like word with a comma, so people can make sense that synergy is not some sort of pie in the sky mysticism sort of thing. We're talking about cooperation with God, because that's what it literally means.
thanks.
All right. So thank you. So I just want to say thank you, Craig, for joining us for a conversation about the authenticity of Dionysius. I find it fascinating, and for all the reasons that you've laid out, in this episode. So if people are just tuning in, please go back and watch this entire episode. I had a couple people, asking in the audience, does Craig really affirm the authenticity of Dionysius? Yep, and he gives his reasons why in this episode and other episodes that he's released on his own channel. And so definitely go back and watch that. So the first question is related to this, and I just kind of stacked them in a way that I'll do the more relevant questions first, and then maybe we can get into some more like irrelevant questions that don't deal as much with this conversation that we're having. But Lamont and then Harry Ludwig brought this up, so I'm gonna knock out two birds with one stone here. Lamont asked, just joined. Dionysius, is he the one that everyone quotes as being Neoplatonic? What do you think about that, Craig?
Yeah, he's pretty much claimed to be a Christian who was just ripping off Neoplatonic theology and naming it Dionysius so people would care. So we're talking about the same guy. We called to question that synopsis of Dionysius.
Fair enough. All right. This one was an interesting one that deals more with Orthodox theology than it does Dionysius the Areopagite. But Harry then comes back and asks, so why the unique designation of saints when the New Testament clearly refers to all Christians as saints? What do you think about that?
I don't know. Actually, I don't know what the etymology of that is. I do know the word saint sounds more official in English than it does when you see in the original languages. Like, in Greek, it's just holy, right? Mm-hmm. So you could technically, right. When we talk the Holy Trinity, it's technically Saint Trinity, So it's, I just think it's a monkier to make clear that someone is holy. Mm-hmm. And so that being said, it's essentially the Hall of Fame of saints are the ones that we canonize as saints. And I'm guessing the early church, because they didn't have canonized saints per se, their saints weren't martyred yet and weren't dead and all that stuff. Maybe it didn't make sense to do it that way. But I do see the reason for linguistic confusion.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the same with priest, right? Because the scriptures, and specifically Peter, calls us, a brotherhood of priests and different, all Christians are priests in some shapes and forms and like that. But I don't think, we're not saying that. I mean, obviously, don't start calling me Saint, Polycarp or whatever. That's the other guy. You know what I mean? The other Polycarp there. So reference to the other Paul. But with that being said, I would consider myself, and Craig, correct me if I'm wrong on this, like in the process of theosis, our hope is to be more like Christ, right? And to be like him in his fullness, whatever that means. We know the promise of St. John is that we will be like him, right? And so that's our hope. And I think anyone, that's faith is in Christ, that's, a part of the church, that has been baptized, like you're on your way to that. And so I don't think we're not, in calling someone a saint, we're not saying that, well, nobody else is, because we've got a lot of saints. And so I think these are just people that have, in their practical lives have showed that. I mean, and they deserve that title in my opinion. Is
Well,
there any
the
follow up?
recognition is important because it gives us an example to follow. There's plenty more people in
Right,
heaven than we have canonized saints, but do we want to follow everyone's example?
right,
Some examples would be to our detriment. And so I think that's why saints are canonized ultimately, is because their example is so important.
right. That's good. All right. I know this answer, and oh, Dale, did you want to say something? Sorry.
Oh no, I was just I was selecting James B for the next one. But
Yeah, I had that too. Do you want to go ahead and read that?
absolutely. So let me bring that up. So James B is so this will be interesting. Does the Orthodox Church have a dogmatic stance on the age of the earth?
The age of the earth is mentioned in ecumenical councils. It's not a matter of like they decree it saying you must accept this is the age of the earth. But it is a young earth. I think every saint that's ever commented on the question believes in a young earth. Um, I have to say, personally, I'm not entirely convinced that this is a point of doctrine. Because what is a point of doctrine is the faith that's been delivered once to the saints, not like all these scientific and historical questions. I'm not sure, I could be wrong, but someone had to convince me that when God made a promise to the church that it would not fall into error, that this includes that the church can't make wrong historical judgment calls and wrong scientific judgment calls. Now, I'm not trying to say this to give a liberalized, back door so people could believe in an old earth or an evolution. That's not my point. I think evolution is absolutely categorically impossible theologically and scientifically. So that's not my point. But it does seem like young earth gets dragged into this because it has to do with this presumption that this is not an error Christians can make as a matter of principle. And I think that has to be established. I'm open to it being established that yes, the church can't make a consensus wrong historical opinion. But I think that would have to be established because I just don't know any saints and any documents of importance that actually make that argument. But yet the whole debate over young earth versus old earth and some of these other questions, whether or not a council quotes a saint, but it's actually a forgery and stuff like that. And so then people argue, well, it can't be a forgery because a council quoted it. That presumes upon that there's a preservation of historical and scientific error. And that would have to be established that is a real thing. I'm not just going to presume it's a thing because people talk about it. Like that has to be established that no, this really is a thing. I do think it's morally safest to believe in a young earth because obviously that's the plainest example from the scripture. It's the plainest application that all Christians have drawn. So I do think it's morally safe to draw that conclusion. But I would say if you're a scientist, I don't think there's anything wrong with going where the evidence leads you, if it's towards younger, towards older, but just being honest with the methodology. And so, we just want to be careful that you don't want to, Christianity at no point says you can't have valid scientific progress and stuff like that. And so that does get into geology, less so evolution. I think that's essentially a pseudoscience, but I'll leave that to the scientists really to make better judgments for some of the aspects of evolutionary theory. Like obviously, I don't think anyone rejects microevolution. We know there's survival of the fittest. We know that those things, do actually occur. It's macroevolution that's the real issue, right? So I think there's certain valid aspects of geology and evolutionary theory that people should look into as scientists, because science is an empirical science is a legitimate discipline. And I don't think the church necessarily is the guardian of empirical science. You would have to establish, or for that matter, good historical methodology. You'd have to establish that's a promise made. And if I'm wrong, fine, I'll take correction on that point. But let me just say this very quickly then, though, just so that way people don't take me. Don't believe in evolution. Don't believe in old earth. You have nothing to gain for it. But I leave this to the bishops and to the theologians to actually work out, is this really a point of dogma? Because I'm just not aware of why it would be a point of dogma.
Right. I just want to quickly follow up because this will be something interesting. So from the standpoint of dogma, I think your answer will your personal answer answers this question. But from the standpoint of church history and the fathers and dogma and all that stuff, does the Orthodox Church, what's their teaching on the nature of the flood? Is that a global flood, or can it be?
Oh yeah, no, that's, I don't think anyone doesn't take that literally,
Okay.
about the global flood. Um, it's so I don't think that's an issue.
Okay, so it can't. Someone like Hugh Ross saying, "Oh, it was just a local flood that wiped out all of humanity." That's a no go from a church history standpoint.
The whole Orthodox approach to history is very iconified. And so even with hagiographies, we approach things which as historical fact, because that's the right way to approach it, even if it's not intended as historical fact. And so I bring this up not to say, well, the flood's not historical fact, but we should take it as historical fact. My point in bringing this up is we're not even at the wavelength to even say, well, maybe it was just a partial flood, because it's not the question's not relevant to how the Orthodox approach theology. Where the application in the not only just what's in the scriptures, but the hagiographies is to accept and apply literally what you read. And so for that reason, of course, as a matter of discipline, it works it works easiest with a literal historicist approach to these things. But I bring this up to say this is why Orthodox don't even have questions or debates on these questions, because it's theologically irrelevant to how we do things, if that makes sense. It becomes increasingly theologically relevant the more orthodoxy becomes a Western phenomenon, not only just in the English language, but we have people in the East getting educated in the West, and then problems that didn't exist historically in the East become Eastern problems. And for what it's worth, what we are starting to see is essentially very similar to Protestant fundamentalism on how these questions are approached. And we see this like with Father Daniel Sazoyev, because he's a saint that was martyred in 2009 in Moscow. Moscow is a multicultural city. It's a beautiful thing. If you watch a Moscow liturgy in Pascha, they give 15 different translations of the gospel reading, English, French, German, Asian languages, everything, because the point is Moscow has all these different kinds of people. And so this is relevant because it seems like these sort of Western preoccupations aren't just Western anymore. And what we're starting to see is the response to the church on these questions, like with Seraphim Rose, with Daniel Sazoyev, seems to be more akin to Protestant fundamentalism. So what I think where this may go is really no different than the fundamentalist stance on these questions. I'm just not convinced of it yet. Because this is too recent a phenomena for me, a historian, to really give a good judgment on something so recent. But I'd be lying to say this doesn't seem like to be where the wind is blowing in recent years.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Over to you, Tyler.
All right, Craig. Well, again, brother, I appreciate you coming on and stopping by and talking with me about this. I think it's, like I said, it's enlightening, and I look forward to your paper that you're about to release. I hope that people will read it. I hope people will take it seriously, and start using this apologetic methodology in their apologetics. I think it's absolutely fascinating that the Dionysius that St. Luke speaks about and writes about in Acts, we actually have writings from him if this is proven to be authentic. I think it's absolutely groundbreaking, like you said earlier. And so this is awesome. I've enjoyed every minute of this conversation. I do want to give you a chance to plug anything that I know you're currently working on, some things that you mentioned in the beginning. If you want to go ahead and take some time to plug that, then we'll wrap.
Well, just quick plugs. Obviously, check out orthodoxchristiantheology.com to see what I'm up to. You can check the Orthodox Christian Theology YouTube channel. If you're really interested in history of the papacy, there's the rise and fall of the papacy. By all means, check that out. Most of all, my big thing is to raise money for the parishes in Cambodia. So if this has blessed you and you want to support evangelistic work and missionary work, you can go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. And that's pretty much all my plugs. Would appreciate prayers for the mission and for myself, and that if no money, no books, whatever, that'd be more than great. I'd really appreciate it.
Right on. And look out for the book that Craig held up just a second ago. I'm just going to say there might be The Rise and Fall of the Papacy. there might just be an audiobook in works. So I don't know, but I'm just saying there might be. And so
All
I'm
I
going
can
to
say is
talk.
it make my wife's day.
I know it would.
She keeps asking me questions like, "What's this say? What's that say?" You know, I was like, "Why do I have to read it? Why can't there be an audiobook?" My own wife. I'll
Well,
read my book.
let's chat about that after I get done with this outro, and then that might be coming, y'all. So look out for that. But I do have Craig's YouTube channel linked in the description, and then I will put a link to his website as well. But brother, thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating. Dale, thank you for joining me as well. I thought you had some very interesting follow-ups. Is there anything that you will want to plug before we get out of here, Dale?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of Real Seekers, next Friday, if assuming all's going to plan, I've prepared my presentation on biblical prophecies. So I'm gonna
Okay.
make a couple of arguments. I have my own argument, which I think is unique. It's a circumstantial argument based on messianic prophecies. So that's a little bit different. It's not the traditional argument from direct prophecy. And then I also want to present an argument by a scholar named John Bloom and Rob Newman, and others, called the Twin Cities prophecies. So he basically has kind of a control. It's kind of a criteria for saying, hey, there's something to these prophecies. We can prove that there's some kind of supernatural element going on because there is a falsification test that we can apply. So yeah, I just want to present their argument and see what people think. I'm even myself, I'm a little bit skeptical on it, but I think it deserves to be presented and considered, and it'll be something that the Faith and Altar audience hasn't seen before. And then on Saturday, and I'll shut up after this so I don't hog the mic, but on Saturday, David Russell, Faith and Altars David Russell, will be joining me to speak with the famous Dr. Paul Copan to speak about his book, Is God a Moral Monster? And we're going to be looking at all the typical new atheist objections to God being, that quote of Richard Dawkins, he's malevolent, malicious, nefarious, blah, blah, blah kind of thing. We're going to be looking at all of the new atheist arguments against the morality of the Old Testament God. And that's what I got planned for next week.
All right, right on. So look forward to that, everybody. And then just a quick announcement from me. So we are almost at 4,000 subscribers. Once that happens, we will be releasing our Patreon. So me and the guys have been talking about how we can how we can do those tiers, and I think we've got some pretty good ideas. So if you want a Faith and Ultra Patreon, I know there are some people that's interested in that. Definitely try to get us to 4,000 subs. We're only like 100 away. It's super close. And so like, share, and comment on the videos. That really helps with the YouTube algorithm. And we will see you next time. Until then, good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.